Okay, listeners, get ready because today we are diving deep into a Marvel rivalry for the ages.
Yeah,
Captain America versus Iron Man.
that's a good one.
And we're not just talking about like who would win in a fight.
Right.
We're going to be talking about like their philosophies, their leadership styles,
Yeah.
what it really means to be a hero
Exactly.
in a world that's full of gray areas, not just black and white.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, we've got a lot to pull from. We've got comics, movies. We even have a podcast that we're going to be talking about called Circus that really breaks down this rivalry.
Yeah, and I think what makes this rivalry so fascinating is that both Captain America and Iron Man are, considered the good guys, the heroes, but their approaches to heroism are so fundamentally different.
Yeah.
And it's not just like a superficial difference. It really gets down to the core of who they are as characters.
Right. Like they represent two sides of the same coin.
Right.
But it's like the coin keeps flipping,
Exactly.
and it lands on heads sometimes, it lands on tails, depending on the challenge they're fixing.
Exactly.
So where do we even begin?
Well, I think a great place to start is always with the origin stories.
Yeah.
Because as the Versus podcast points out, their backstories really lay the foundation for their worldview and how they approach problems.
Right. Absolutely. So let's go all the way back
Yeah.
to their origins.
All the way back. So we have Steve Rogers, this, skinny kid from Brooklyn, heart of gold,
Yeah.
wants to fight for his country, but can't because he's just too weak.
Too small.
Too small.
Yeah.
And he gets transformed into Captain America, the peak of human physical perfection.
Yeah.
A symbol of American patriotism. And his story is, born out of World War II. It's that classic tale of overcoming adversity, fighting for freedom.
And it's interesting to think about how that origin story, being rooted in such a specific historical context,
Yeah.
really shapes his whole worldview.
Oh, absolutely.
He's literally, a man out of time,
Yeah.
trying to navigate a world that is drastically different from the one that he left behind.
Right. And then we have Tony Stark,
Yeah.
the billionaire genius who creates the first Iron Man suit. He builds it as a means of survival while he's being held captive. So he's not born with superpowers.
Right.
He creates them.
Yeah.
And his story is all about using intellect, technology to overcome limitations, not just his own, but potentially humanity's as well.
And that's a really interesting contrast right there
Yeah.
between, like, you got inherent ability with Cap,
Mm-hmm.
and then you've got technology and enhancement
Yeah.
with Iron Man. And that really comes through in their strengths and weaknesses, too.
Oh,
right?
absolutely.
Like, Cap, his greatest strength, you could argue, is that unwavering moral compass.
Mm-hmm.
But let's face it, that can also make him a little bit inflexible at times.
Sure.
And the Versus podcast actually makes a really interesting point. They say that in the modern world, where threats aren't always so black and white,
Yeah.
Cap's righteousness, like his very clear sense of right and wrong, can almost be a liability.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they make a very strong case for that. And they point out that in the comics, there are instances where his refusal to compromise, his adherence to this very strict moral code, has actually put other people in danger.
Now that's interesting,
Yeah.
because it kind of challenges our traditional idea of the uncompromising hero.
Right.
And it makes you think, like, is flexibility sometimes necessary
Yeah.
for the greater good?
Absolutely.
It's a tough question. And then you've got Iron Man on the other side of the coin,
Yeah.
who's all about adapting and evolving,
Yeah.
using technology
Right.
to overcome any obstacle.
Yeah.
And he's often like several steps ahead,
Mm-hmm.
always strategizing, planning for every possible outcome.
Right.
Except, of course, for when someone manages to steal his tech
Yeah, that happens.
or figure out a way to disable his suit.
Yeah.
And then it's back to basics.
Yeah.
And we see that, underneath all the fancy gadgets and the technology,
Yeah.
Tony Stark is still a very human, very flawed individual.
Mm.
And this kind of brings us to their big showdown,
Yes.
Civil War,
Yes.
where these contrasting philosophies just come to a head.
Yeah.
And they clash. And Versus the podcast, they frame it as this whole debate over security versus freedom. Right?
Yeah, they do. And what's so compelling about that debate is that both sides have very legitimate points.
Yeah.
So, we have Tony Stark. He's really scarred by what happened with Ultron.
Yeah.
And, Ultron, just to remind folks, is an AI that he created that almost destroyed the world.
Yeah. Talk about unintended consequences.
Yeah. And so he is arguing for superhero registration, government oversight.
Hmm.
He's all about accountability. He wants to make sure that unchecked power doesn't lead to another disaster.
And you can totally see where he's coming from.
Oh,
I think
yeah.
he carries that weight
Yeah.
of those consequences on his shoulders. But then you have Captain America
Right.
on the other side who's like, no, no, no. Registration, that's a slippery slope towards control and manipulation.
Yeah.
And the podcast, they highlight how Cap's own experience, like with, covert organizations like Hydra,
Yeah.
which, infiltrated S.H.I.E.L.D.,
Right.
that's really fueled his distrust of centralized power.
Yeah. And that distrust is not just paranoia. Like, he's seen firsthand how power can be corruptive,
Yeah.
how good intentions can be twisted for, nefarious purposes.
Yeah.
So for him, freedom is not just some, abstract ideal.
Right.
It's a safeguard
Yeah.
against tyranny.
And it's interesting,
Yeah.
listener, because, we're not just talking about superheroes fighting here. We're talking about this battle of ideologies that plays out in our own world all the time.
All the time.
And it really makes you think, where do you stand on this?
Yeah.
Do you prioritize security,
Mm-hmm.
even if it means maybe having to give up some of your individual freedoms?
Yeah.
Or do you think freedom is paramount,
Right.
even if it means, accepting a certain level of risk?
Exactly. And Civil War really throws a wrench into the idea that there are easy answers to this.
Yeah, for sure.
Because they both make very compelling points.
Yeah.
And it's not just a philosophical debate, it's personal for them.
Yeah.
These are friends, these are allies
Right.
who end up on opposite sides
Yeah.
of this really difficult line.
And I think that's what makes it so compelling,
Absolutely.
is that it's not about saying who's right and who's wrong.
Right.
It's about exploring those gray areas,
Yeah.
the complexities of what it means to be human,
Yeah.
and recognizing that even heroes
Yeah.
can be deeply flawed.
Of course.
But often those flaws are born out of their greatest strengths.
Exactly. Yeah.
Right.
And that's what keeps us engaged. We see ourselves in these characters, we struggle with similar dilemmas,
Yeah.
and we're forced to confront the fact that even the so-called good guys make mistakes.
Yeah. And those mistakes have consequences.
Oh, for sure.
Which is something we're going to be talking about a lot more when we get into their legacies and how they continue to shape the MCU.
Absolutely.
But for now, I think we need to take a closer look at some of the specific arguments
Yeah.
that are presented in the Versus podcast,
Yeah.
especially regarding Civil War,
Yes.
because these arguments, they're not just about superheroes.
No.
They're about choices that we all make
Right.
as individuals and as a society.
Exactly.
So let's dive in a little deeper.
Let's do it. One thing that really struck me about the Versus podcast is how deeply they dove into the whole Civil War thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's this one point where they highlight a moment when Tony Stark brings up the Sokovia Accords, which, is that document at the heart of all this superhero registration debate.
Yeah, the one that divides the Avengers.
Exactly. And he points out that it's not just about control,
Right.
It's about the Avengers taking responsibility
Yeah.
for all the power they have.
Like, he brings up the collateral damage from previous battles.
Oh, totally. Like Sokovia.
All the devastation in Age of Ultron.
Exactly. And the podcast really argues that for Tony, it's not even just about preventing future disasters. It's about trying to make up for what's already happened.
Yeah, like atonement.
Yeah, exactly. He feels so much guilt
Right.
for the lives that were lost. And the Accords are like his way of trying to ensure...
To make amends.
Yeah, to make amends that it'll never happen again.
But of course, Steve Rogers sees it way differently.
Oh, absolutely.
He's like, if we sign this thing, we're basically giving up our ability to act independently.
Right, to make decisions based on what we believe is right.
Yeah, our own judgment.
Yeah, instead of what some committee decides.
And the podcast makes this really interesting point about how Cap's experience in the war
Yeah.
really shapes his perspective here.
Oh, totally.
He's seen how easily governments can be manipulated,
Oh, yeah.
how good intentions can get twisted.
Totally, to serve some hidden agenda.
Exactly, which is why he's so hesitant
Yeah.
to give up that autonomy.
He doesn't trust it.
He doesn't. He believes that to be a true hero, you have to be willing to make the tough calls, even if it means going against authority.
Even if it means standing alone.
Yeah, and the podcast even draws this really cool parallel
Yeah.
to one of Cap's most iconic moments,
Oh, which one?
when he stood up against S.H.I.E.L.D.,
Oh, right.
when he found out they'd been infiltrated by Hydra.
It was such a huge turning point.
Right, he was basically turning against the very organization he was a part of.
Yeah.
But he knew it was the right thing to do.
He had to.
And that's a perfect example of how his distrust of authority isn't just theoretical or hypothetical.
It's
rooted in real experience.
Exactly. He's seen how bad things can get.
He's been there.
Yeah, when you blindly follow orders.
And now he's willing to fight for what he believes in.
Yeah.
No matter what.
But the podcast makes a really interesting point about how that very same conviction can also be a weakness.
You mean his unwavering belief in what's right?
Exactly. Like, in a world that's full of gray areas, sometimes you need to be flexible.
To bend a little.
Yeah, his rigid adherence to that moral code makes it really hard for him to navigate.
The nuances.
Exactly.
It's like this classic dilemma. Do you stick to your principles even when it leads to bad outcomes?
Yeah.
Or do you compromise to achieve something better?
That's the question, isn't it?
Civil War really makes both Cap and Iron Man face that.
It does.
And there are just no easy answers.
No, and I think that's what makes this rivalry so fascinating. It's like a mirror to our own struggles.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we all face these choices.
Right.
Between our ideals and what's actually possible.
The real world.
Exactly. It's messy.
Yeah, and it's not about picking sides.
Right.
It's about understanding that both approaches have value. And that true heroism is often somewhere in between.
Finding that balance.
Exactly. But how does that play out in terms of their legacy?
Oh, that's a great question.
Because even though both characters have made huge sacrifices, their influence continues on.
Oh, for sure.
In the MCU.
Definitely. And the Versus podcast even talks about this.
Okay.
Pointing out that Iron Man's legacy is especially complex.
Oh, how so?
Well, he dies a hero in Endgame, right?
Right. Sacrifices himself to save the universe.
The ultimate sacrifice, but his technology lives on.
That's true.
And that becomes a huge theme in later movies. Like, who controls it and how will it be used?
Because it's powerful stuff.
It is, and it could easily fall into the wrong hands.
That's the point the podcast is making.
Yeah, Iron Man's greatest creation could also be his most dangerous legacy.
Ooh, that's a good way to put it.
And it actually ties back to one of the big themes of the whole Iron Man trilogy.
Oh, yeah.
Like how weapons can be misused.
Right, even with good intentions.
Yeah, how things can go so wrong.
Like Spider-Man, Far From Home.
Oh, yeah, great example.
When Mysterio uses Tony's tech to cause all this chaos.
And he was a disgruntled employee from Stark Industries.
Exactly. And it just shows that even the best inventions, those with the best intentions, can have these terrible unintended consequences.
Absolutely. It makes you think about responsibility. What happens when technology advances so fast?
That's a huge question for all of us, isn't it?
It really is. But Iron Man's legacy isn't just about the dangers of technology.
Right.
It's also about mentorship.
Oh, yeah.
Passing on his knowledge to a new generation.
Like with Peter Parker.
Yes, and now Riri Williams?
Ironheart.
Exactly.
And the podcast argues that this part of his legacy might be even more important than his actual tech.
It's about inspiring others to use their abilities for good, to make the world a better place.
Even if it means making tough choices.
Exactly, and maybe even sacrifices.
Which brings us to Captain America's legacy.
Yes.
And it's interesting how the podcast contrasts his decision to give the shield to Sam Wilson.
Right.
With Iron Man's whole tech inheritance thing.
That's a really good point.
Like, they say that Iron Man's legacy is mostly about innovation and progress.
Yeah.
While Cap's is more about upholding values, inspiring others to fight for what's right.
Yeah, even when it's hard.
No matter what. And they even talk about Sam Wilson's struggle in The Falcon and the Winter Soldier.
To live up to that ideal.
Right. He's not a super soldier.
He doesn't have the serum.
Right. He doesn't have decades of experience.
Yeah, and he's really aware of the racial dynamics.
Yeah, something Steve never had to deal with.
Exactly. And the podcast says that Sam's journey as Cap is all about redefining what it means to be a hero.
Okay.
It's about acknowledging that the world is complicated.
Right.
And that we need different perspectives.
Yeah, to face today's challenges.
And they think Captain America, Brave New World,
the new movie,
is going to continue exploring those themes.
Oh, interesting.
Like how Sam navigates a world that's so divided.
Where people are losing hope.
Yeah, and they think the film will really delve into what leadership means in the 21st century.
What does it take to be a symbol of hope?
Right, in a world that seems to be falling apart.
And I think that's a great segue into the Versus podcast's final verdict on the whole Captain America versus Iron Man debate.
So who wins?
Well, they actually conclude that. Well, they actually conclude that there isn't really a clear winner.
Yeah, they say it's not about that.
Right.
It's about what you value.
Like what matters most to you.
Exactly. Like, are you more drawn to unwavering morality and strong leadership?
Like Captain America.
Yeah. Or do you value innovation and being adaptable?
Even if it means making those tough choices.
Like Iron Man.
Where sometimes you have to bend the rules a bit.
Right, and it's not about saying one hero is better. They both have their strengths.
And their weaknesses.
Exactly, and the podcast does a really good job of not just telling you about these differences, but showing you how they play out.
With examples.
Yeah, from the comics and the movies.
Like they talk about how Cap's strong morals.
Right, that unyielding sense of right and wrong.
Sometimes it can actually backfire.
It can. And then, on the flip side...
You've got Iron Man, who can be impulsive.
Yeah.
And that can lead to...
unintended consequences.
Exactly.
It's like that saying...
Which one?
You know, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
Like they're both trying to do good.
Make the world a better place.
But their methods clash.
They do, and those clashes can have some pretty big ripple effects.
Oh, yeah. It goes way beyond just them.
And the podcast even suggests that this whole tension between Cap's idealism and Iron Man's pragmatism, it kind of reflects the big debates we're having in society today.
Oh,
like security versus freedom.
Yeah.
Individual rights versus collective responsibility. Tradition versus progress.
It's out there.
And these characters embody those conflicts.
They do.
In a way that makes you think.
In a way that's fun to watch.
Yeah, for sure.
But also makes you question things.
And maybe even question yourself.
Right, like what do you believe in?
Where do you stand on these issues?
Exactly. And the podcast argues that by really looking at these characters...
and their stories.
We can understand our own values better.
Oh, that's interesting.
And how those values influence what we do.
In the real world.
Yeah, it's not about choosing Team Cap or Team Iron Man.
It's bigger than that.
It's about recognizing that they both represent something essential.
About being human.
Exactly.
With all their complexities and contradictions.
And maybe by understanding their struggles.
Yeah, their flaws, their triumphs.
We can find a better balance in ourselves.
Okay.
A balance that helps us deal with this crazy world.
With compassion, but also with conviction.
That's a powerful message.
It is, and I think that's why people are still so drawn to this rivalry.
Even after all this time.
It's not just about two guys fighting.
It's about something deeper.
It's about us.
It's about the kind of world we want to live in.
And the choices we make to get there.
And the podcast leaves us with this final thought.
Okay.
The real legacy of Captain America and Iron Man isn't about who wins or loses.
It's about the conversation they start.
The questions they raise.
About what it means to be a hero.
A leader, a responsible person.
In a world that's constantly changing.
That's a great point to end on.
It is so, listener, as you keep exploring the Marvel Universe.
Yeah.
Remember that these stories are more than just entertainment.
They're about us.
They reflect our own struggles.
Our hopes, our fears.
And maybe by looking at their journeys, we could find a path forward for ourselves.
To a better future.
A future that's brighter, more heroic.
Well said. I think that wraps up our deep dive.
It does a fascinating look at this iconic rivalry.
Yeah. Until next time, keep exploring.
Keep questioning.
And keep believing in the power of story.
To inspire us.
And to challenge us to be our best selves.